There's a moment in history when a single voyage changed the fate of two worlds forever, a crossing of oceans that rewrote maps, transformed empires, and reshaped humanity's understanding of the planet itself. It's a story of courage and ambition, but also of misunderstanding, greed, and consequences that still ripple through centuries. It begins with one man, a sailor who refused to accept the limits of the known world. Hello and welcome to the Other Side Stories. Here we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. Our story begins in the late 15th century, an age of uncertainty, faith, and restless curiosity. Europe was a continent in transition. The Renaissance was awakening minds. Art, science, and exploration were thriving. Yet trade routes remained the arteries of power. The world's wealth flowed from spices, silk, and gold that came from Asia. And whoever controlled the sea routes controlled destiny itself. For centuries, merchants and sailors had traveled eastward overland through the Silk Road, a network of routes stretching from Europe to China. But with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, that ancient pathway became blocked by the rising Ottoman Empire. Suddenly, European kingdoms found themselves desperate for a new way to reach the riches of the Orient, India, China, and the islands of spices. Among the dreamers who sought a solution was a man named Christopher Columbus, or Cristoforo Colombo in his native Italian. Born in Genoa around 1451, Columbus was not of noble birth. He was the son of a humble wool weaver, a man of modest means but limitless ambition. From a young age, Columbus was drawn to the sea. He studied navigation, astronomy, and geography, and read every text he could find about the shape of the earth and the mysteries beyond the horizon. At the time, most educated Europeans already knew the earth was round. That's a common myth, that people in Columbus's day thought the world was flat. In truth, sailors and scholars had accepted a spherical earth for centuries. What they debated was its size. Columbus believed that by sailing west, he could reach Asia faster than by rounding Africa. His calculations, however, were wrong, dangerously wrong. He underestimated the size of the earth by thousands of miles. He thought Asia was much closer than it actually was. Yet, his error would become the foundation of one of history's most famous voyages. In the 1480s, Columbus began seeking royal support for his plan, a western route to Asia. He approached the courts of Portugal, England, and France, but was rejected each time. The idea seemed too risky, too uncertain. The Portuguese were already sending ships down the coast of Africa under explorers like Bartholomew Diaz, who had just reached the Cape of Good Hope. Why gamble on an untested route when a proven one was already opening? But Columbus was relentless. His faith in God and in his own destiny burned brighter than doubt. He was convinced he had been chosen for a divine purpose, to bring Christianity to new lands and to fulfill a prophecy that the world would soon end, ushering in Christ's return. For him, exploration wasn't just about trade, it was about salvation. After years of rejection, he finally found hope in the Spanish court. Spain, newly united under King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, was eager to expand its power. In 1492, after the fall of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, the monarchs turned their attention outward, towards the seas. Columbus's timing was perfect. Still, even in Spain, he faced skepticism. His demands were bold: titles of nobility, a share of the profits, and the right to govern any lands he discovered. But Isabella, perhaps moved by his conviction or the promise of new wealth, agreed. On April 17, 1492, the capitulations of Santa Fe were signed, granting Columbus what he sought. The dream of sailing west to reach the east was about to become reality. On August 3, 1492, from the port of Palos de la Frontera, Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They were small vessels, nothing like the massive ships we imagine in legends. The Santa Maria, his flagship, was barely 70 feet long. The crew consisted of around 90 men, sailors, soldiers, and adventurers, many of them skeptical or even fearful of what lay ahead. As the ships pushed westward into the Atlantic, the familiar coasts of Europe disappeared behind them. Days turned into weeks. The ocean stretched endlessly, blue and silent. No one had ever sailed this far west before. The men began to whisper of sea monsters, of falling off the edge of the world, of never returning home. Tension grew. Columbus kept 2 sets of logs, one true, one false, to hide the real distance traveled and calm his anxious crew. Night after night, he gazed at the stars, using his astrolabe and dead reckoning to guide them onward. Faith was his compass, ambition his wind. And though doubt gnawed at his mind, he refused to turn back. By early October, supplies were dwindling. The crew threatened mutiny. They begged him to reverse course. But Columbus made them a promise. If they did not find land within 3 days, he would turn back. Then, in the early hours of October 12, 1492, a cry pierced the darkness. "Tierra! Tierra! Land!" It was Rodrigo de Triana aboard the Pinta who first saw it. On the horizon lay the faint outline of an island bathed in moonlight. Columbus had done it. He believed he had reached the Indies, the islands off the coast of Asia. He named the island San Salvador, Holy Savior. In truth, he had landed in the Bahamas, on an island known today as Guanahani. When he stepped ashore, he carried the banner of Spain and claimed the land in the name of Ferdinand and Isabella. The people who greeted him were the Taino, indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean. They were gentle, curious, and welcoming. Columbus wrote in his journal that they were generous and could easily be converted to Christianity. But his words also carried another tone, one of exploitation. They would make good servants, he wrote. From San Salvador, Columbus explored nearby islands, including Cuba, which he mistook for mainland China, and Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which he thought was Japan. He built a small settlement called La Navidad, using the remains of his wrecked ship, the Santa Maria. Leaving some men behind, he set sail back to Spain in January 1493, carrying news that would electrify Europe. When Columbus returned to Spain in March, he was hailed as a hero. Bells rang, crowds gathered, and the monarchs welcomed him with honors. He spoke of golden lands, of exotic people, of endless opportunity. Spain rejoiced, for it seemed that God had favored them with a new world. But this was only the beginning. Columbus made 3 more voyages in 1493, 1498, and 1502, each one revealing new lands, the Lesser Antilles, Trinidad, the coasts of South America, and Central America. Yet he never realized the full truth, that he had stumbled not upon the fringes of Asia, but on an entirely unknown continent. To his dying day, Columbus believed he had reached the Indies. His discoveries set off a chain reaction that would change history forever. The age of exploration exploded. Other nations followed Spain's lead: Portugal, England, France, each racing to claim new territories. The old world collided with the new, and the results were both wondrous and tragic. For the indigenous people of the Americas, the arrival of Europeans marked the beginning of a devastating era of conquest, enslavement, and disease. Within decades, millions would perish. The Taino, the very people who had first greeted Columbus with open arms, were nearly wiped out. Smallpox, influenza, and violence spread like wildfire. What Columbus called discovery became, for them, a catastrophe. Still, from the European perspective, his voyage was seen as the dawn of a new age, the bridge between medieval and modern history. The Atlantic world was born, connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas through trade, migration, and empire. Columbus's legacy is therefore a paradox, a story of vision and destruction, of glory and guilt. He opened the door to a new world, but also unleashed forces that would reshape civilizations, redraw maps, and define the course of humanity for centuries. To understand Columbus is to understand the human spirit, its capacity for courage, curiosity, and faith, but also its hunger for power and its blindness to the lives it changes. As the sun rose over the Caribbean that October morning in 1492, no one on those tiny ships could have imagined the immensity of what they had done. The world they knew had ended, and a new one had begun. But let's step back for a moment and look deeper at what truly drove this man, and how his vision, flawed as it was, became a symbol of Europe's unrelenting quest for the unknown. Columbus wasn't just a sailor, he was a dreamer, forged by the spirit of the Renaissance. The world around him was rediscovering ancient knowledge. Books like The Travels of Marco Polo filled his imagination with visions of golden palaces, spices, and silk-covered cities. The printing press, newly invented, spread ideas faster than ever before. The stars, the sea, and the scriptures all whispered to him that destiny lay west. And so he calculated, he argued, he begged. He spent years at the court of Portugal's King John II, who dismissed him after experts proved his math was wrong. He turned then to Spain, living. When Christopher Columbus returned to Spain in 1493, he brought with him not only tales of new lands, but also symbols of proof: exotic parrots, gold trinkets, strange fruits, and a few of the native Taíno people he had taken captive. To the Spanish crown and to the people of Europe, it was evidence of something extraordinary, a world beyond the horizon, rich with promise. The news spread like wildfire. In an age without telegraphs, newspapers, or the internet, word of mouth and royal proclamations carried the story across Europe. A new route to the Indies, they said, lands filled with gold and souls waiting to be saved. But what no one yet realized was that Columbus had not reached Asia at all. He had touched a world unknown to Europeans, Africans, and Asians alike. The Spanish monarchs, thrilled by the potential wealth and prestige, immediately organized a second voyage, much larger than the first. In September 1493, Columbus departed again, this time commanding 17 ships and over 1,200 men, including soldiers, priests, and settlers. This was not an expedition of exploration alone, it was a mission of colonization. They carried with them livestock, seeds, weapons, and crosses, symbols of Europe's intent to remake the world in its own image. Among their goals were to establish permanent colonies, spread Christianity, and extract resources for the Spanish crown. When they reached the Caribbean, they discovered that the small fort of La Navidad, which Columbus had built on Hispaniola during his first voyage, had been destroyed, and the men he left behind were dead. Relations between the Spaniards and the Taíno had turned violent, the first hint of what was to come. Still, Columbus pressed forward. He founded a new settlement called La Isabela, the first European town in the Americas. But it quickly became a place of disease, hunger, and despair. The settlers, unaccustomed to tropical conditions and dependent on indigenous labor, faced enormous difficulties. The paradise they imagined turned to struggle. Columbus, now more a governor than an explorer, faced rebellion among his men and tension with the native populations. The Taíno, once generous hosts, grew resentful of the Spaniards' demands for gold and labor. Columbus enforced harsh measures, punishments, and forced tribute to extract resources. The dream of peaceful conversion gave way to the harsh reality of conquest. Still, in Europe, he remained a celebrated hero. When his reports reached Spain, they spoke of magnificent lands and untold riches. Maps were redrawn. The ocean, once feared as endless, now seemed like a bridge to fortune. The Pope, seeking to maintain peace between Spain and Portugal, issued the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, dividing the world between the two empires. Spain would claim lands to the west of a certain line, Portugal to the east. The New World was now a prize to be divided, even though no one yet knew its full size or nature. By the time of Columbus's third voyage in 1498, the tone of his adventures had changed. He was no longer the daring navigator proving his theories, but an embattled administrator trying to control a restless colony. That voyage took him farther south, to the coast of South America, near present-day Venezuela. When he saw the massive flow of the Orinoco River, he was stunned. No mere island could hold such waters. For a moment, he suspected he had found something greater, perhaps even the earthly paradise described in the Bible. Yet, despite this discovery, his fortune was turning. Reports of his cruelty toward both colonists and indigenous people reached Spain. Complaints grew that he ruled tyrannically, punishing disobedience with whippings, hangings, and mutilations. In 1500, the Spanish crown sent a royal commissioner, Francisco de Bobadilla, to investigate. Columbus was arrested, chained, and sent back to Spain as a prisoner. Imagine that moment. The man who had opened the New World now sitting in the hold of a ship bound in iron. He begged the monarchs for mercy, insisting that his enemies had lied about him. In a letter, he wrote, "I have come to serve their highnesses, and I have done it with a perfect heart and with love." Ferdinand and Isabella eventually released him, restoring some honors but stripping him of his governorship. The admiral was free, but his reputation was tarnished. Still, he refused to give up his dream. In 1502, at the age of 51, Columbus embarked on his fourth and final voyage, a desperate attempt to find a westward passage to Asia. He sailed along the coasts of Central America, enduring storms, shipwrecks, and hostility from native peoples and even his own crew. His health was failing, his authority eroded. After months stranded in Jamaica, he finally returned to Spain in 1504, old, ill, and largely forgotten. He died 2 years later, in 1506, believing he had reached the fringes of Asia. He never knew that he had found a continent unknown to his world, that his name would become immortal, and his legacy both celebrated and condemned. It was others who would reveal the truth. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller published a new world map labeling the newly discovered lands America, after Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian explorer who argued that these territories were not Asia but a new world. Ironically, the man who dreamed of reaching the Indies was never credited with discovering the new continent. But even if history was unkind to him, his voyage transformed humanity's sense of the possible. For the first time, the globe became a connected whole, Europe, Africa, and the Americas linked through exchange, migration, and conflict. Yet what followed was not the golden age Columbus had imagined. The encounter between old and new worlds led to the Columbian Exchange, a vast transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and ideas that changed life on both sides of the Atlantic. From Europe came horses, cattle, wheat, and sugarcane. From the Americas came maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cocoa. These exchanges transformed diets and economies worldwide. But along with them came smallpox, measles, and influenza, diseases that devastated indigenous populations, killing millions. The Americas became a theater of colonization, slavery, and empire. European powers carved up lands, enslaved native peoples, and imported Africans to toil on plantations. Within a century, the continents Columbus had opened would be drenched in both blood and gold. And yet, amid all the tragedy, there was also transformation. The blending of cultures gave birth to new languages, new religions, and new identities. From the ashes of conquest emerged a hybrid world, neither wholly European nor wholly native, but something entirely new. The Spanish monarchs became a symbol. To some, a hero who expanded the boundaries of human knowledge. To others, a conqueror who brought suffering and death. Statues, cities, and even a national holiday would one day bear his name. But his story is more complex than either praise or blame. It is the story of a man caught between two eras, medieval faith and modern ambition, whose vision changed the course of history. Behind every myth lies a man, and behind every discovery, a cost. The voyage of 1492 did not just change geography, it changed the human imagination. It taught Europe that the world was far larger and far more diverse than it had ever imagined. It sparked centuries of exploration, colonization, and exchange that would define the modern age. But perhaps the most haunting question is this: did Columbus truly discover America, or did he merely stumble upon it? The word discovery suggests something new, something found where nothing was before. Yet, for the millions who already lived there, these lands were not new. They had histories stretching back thousands of years, civilizations with cities, agriculture, art, and astronomy. The Aztecs, the Maya, the Inca, each ruled vast empires long before Columbus set sail. To them, his arrival was not discovery, it was invasion. And so, history reminds us that every discovery is also a loss. The meeting of two worlds was both a beginning and an end, a dawn for some, a twilight for others. Still, as the sails of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria faded into the Atlantic mist, they carried more than just a man's ambition. They carried the beginning of our interconnected world, one filled with possibility, peril, and paradox. Columbus's courage, however flawed, reminds us of a truth that defines humanity. We are creatures who seek the unknown. We venture into uncertainty, sometimes guided by faith, sometimes by greed, often by both. And in doing so, we reshape the world, for better or worse. To stand on the deck of his ship, staring into the vast blue unknown, was to stand at the edge of everything humanity had ever known, and to leap. That leap, across an ocean, across doubt, across fear, would change the world forever. The voyage of Columbus did not only open a sea route, it opened an age. The age of discovery transformed maps, commerce, faith, and power in ways the 15th century world could never have imagined. But at the center of this seismic shift remained the figure of one man, Christopher Columbus, torn between divine purpose and earthly ambition. After his death in 1506, his name faded briefly into silence. The focus shifted toward new explorers who followed his wake, men like Vasco da Gama, John Cabot, Hernán Cortés, and Francisco Pizarro, who expanded the frontiers of empire and conquest. Yet behind their journeys lay the same question that had haunted Columbus: what lay beyond the horizon, and how far could human ambition reach before it consumed itself? The truth of his voyages began to unfold slowly. In the early 16th century, letters and journals of explorers revealed the vastness of the newly found lands. This was no mere extension of Asia. It was something else entirely, a new world. The irony is striking. Columbus had set sail to reach the riches of Cathay and the fabled kingdom of the Great Khan. Instead, he had connected two halves of the planet that had evolved in isolation for millennia. He died not knowing it. Yet his mistake, his miscalculation of Earth's size, became one of the most consequential errors in human history. The consequences of his discovery rippled outward like waves. The Spanish Empire, fueled by ambition and faith, grew into one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Gold and silver from the Americas poured into Europe, enriching monarchs and funding wars. New cities arose across the Atlantic: Havana, Santo Domingo, Mexico City, Lima. The Old World began to feast on the wealth of the new, while the indigenous populations suffered under the weight of conquest. In the early years, the Spanish justified their colonization under the guise of religious mission. They claimed to bring Christianity to heathen lands. Missionaries followed conquistadors, carrying crosses where swords had already struck. Some genuinely believed they were saving souls, others used faith as a tool of control. Among the voices who questioned this new order was Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest who had once owned slaves himself, but later became an advocate for indigenous rights. He wrote of the horrors he witnessed: villages burned, families enslaved, entire peoples wiped out by disease and violence. In his short account of the destruction of the Indies, he pleaded for mercy, calling the colonization of the Americas a mortal sin against God and humanity. His words remind us that even in the earliest days of empire, conscience stirred. Not everyone saw the conquest as glory. Some saw it as tragedy. And still, the legend of Columbus grew. Poets, scholars, and kings hailed him as the man who united the world. In his voyages, they saw the triumph of faith and reason, the proof that human beings could overcome fear and reach for the impossible. Statues rose, hymns were sung, and centuries later, a national holiday would bear his name. But behind every legend lies complexity. Columbus's own writings reveal a man of contradictions: deeply religious yet ruthless in command, visionary yet blinded by pride, convinced of divine favor yet tormented by failure. In one of his final letters, he wrote, "The Lord made me the messenger of the new heaven and the new earth, and he showed me the spot where to find it." Even as his fortunes fell, he believed he had fulfilled prophecy. To understand him, one must understand the world that made him. The 15th century was an age of transition, between the medieval and the modern, between faith and science. Navigation was still part art, part mystery. Maps were as much imagination as information. Explorers sailed not only on seas, but on dreams. Columbus's dreams were nourished by the books he read, especially the Travels of Marco Polo, Imango Mundi by Pierre Dailly, and ancient texts describing lands at the edge of the world. These works convinced him that the Earth's circumference was smaller and that Asia lay just beyond the Western Sea. In truth, between Europe and Asia lay an ocean twice as wide as he imagined, and an entire hemisphere. But perhaps it was that very flaw, his refusal to accept limits, that made his voyage possible. The boundary between genius and delusion is often only measured by success. Had he failed, Columbus might have been remembered as a fool. Because he survived, he became immortal. Still, the cost of his triumph was enormous. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas unleashed one of the greatest demographic collapses in history. Within a century, indigenous populations in the Caribbean had nearly vanished. Empires that had flourished for centuries, the Aztec and the Inca, would fall to small bands of conquistadors armed with steel, horses, and disease. The balance of the world had shifted. From this meeting of worlds arose new global systems, the exchange of goods, ideas, and people across the Atlantic. Crops from the Americas, like potatoes, corn, and tobacco, transformed diets and economies in Europe, Asia, and Africa. In return, European livestock and technology reshaped the landscapes of the New World. But beneath the surface of trade and progress lay the shadows of slavery. To replace the indigenous labor force decimated by disease, Europeans began importing enslaved Africans, a cruel enterprise that would persist for over 4 centuries. Thus, the discovery of America became intertwined with one of humanity's darkest chapters. In a cruel twist, Columbus's dream of connecting worlds did come true, but in a way that would haunt generations. Still, it's important to remember that Columbus was not a simple villain. He was a man of his time, guided by the beliefs, ambitions, and blindness of his age. To him, the voyage was a mission from God. To the monarchs, it was a path to wealth and glory. To history, it became the hinge upon which the modern world turned. Let's imagine for a moment the world before 1492. Europe, Asia, and Africa formed a known triangle of civilization. Trade flowed through ancient routes, caravans across deserts, ships along coasts. Beyond the Atlantic lay mystery, a blank expanse marked on maps with dragons, serpents, and the phrase, "Here be monsters." It was not only a physical unknown, but a psychological one. The edge of the map symbolized the edge of imagination. When Columbus crossed that line, he didn't just redraw maps, he redefined human possibility. The world became larger, more complex, more connected. For the first time in history, every continent, every human society was linked in a global web. That moment was the birth of globalization itself. The voyage also changed Europe's self-image. The continent that had long been fractured by war and feudalism now saw itself as the center of a vast new world. Wealth poured in, empires expanded, and a sense of destiny took root, a belief that Europeans had a divine right to explore, claim, and civilize. That idea, born in the wake of Columbus's voyage, would justify centuries of imperialism. Yet it also fueled advancements in science, art, and knowledge. The world Columbus helped reveal thinkers like Copernicus and Galileo, who dared to challenge the universe's boundaries. In this way, his journey became both a spark of enlightenment and a shadow of conquest. But perhaps the most lasting impact was not on kings or maps, but on ordinary human hearts, on the sense that the world was open, that horizons were meant to be crossed. His voyage taught humanity that there was always another side, that beyond the visible lay the unknown. It's no wonder that centuries later, the name Columbus became synonymous with exploration. Cities, rivers, and nations bear his name. Statues of him stand in plazas across the world. And yet, in recent decades, those same monuments have become symbols of debate, torn down or defaced as people reassess the true meaning of his legacy. Was he a hero who defied the impossible, or a harbinger of empire and oppression? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Columbus was neither saint nor monster. He was human, a man driven by conviction, curiosity, and the culture of his time. He sought greatness and achieved it, but at a cost he could not have foreseen. His voyage was both a triumph of navigation and a tragedy of humanity. Perhaps that is why his story still matters, because in it we see ourselves, our courage and our blindness, our dreams and our destruction. 5 centuries later, the echo of his sails still lingers. The world he set in motion has become our own, a world connected, complex, and constantly in search of new horizons. When the sails of Columbus's ships vanished beyond the horizon of Spain in August 1492, few could have imagined that the world they knew was about to end, and that an entirely new one was about to be born. Yet, in the centuries that followed, every aspect of life, politics, religion, economy, and even identity would be reshaped by that voyage. Columbus, in his time, did not see himself as a revolutionary. He was a navigator, a man chasing a dream, and that dream, ironically, was not discovery but access. He wanted a shortcut to Asia, to the riches of India and China. But what he found was a bridge that would connect continents forever. To understand the scale of his impact, we must look beyond the man and into the movement he sparked. His journeys were the beginning of Europe's westward expansion, a tide that would carry explorers, conquerors, missionaries, and settlers across the Atlantic. The Columbian voyages were the spark that ignited the age of empire. Within a generation, Spain had claimed vast territories, the Caribbean islands, Mexico, Peru, and beyond. The conquest of the Aztec Empire by Hernán Cortés in 1521 and of the Inca Empire by Francisco Pizarro in 1533 were direct descendants of Columbus's first crossing. Gold and silver from the mines of the New World flowed into Spanish ports, funding cathedrals, palaces, and armies. But this wealth also brought inflation, corruption, and conflict. The gold that filled Europe's coffers came at the cost of millions of lives across the Atlantic. Still, Europe celebrated itself as the dawn of modernity. The printing press spread Columbus's letters far and wide, transforming his voyage into legend. Artists painted scenes of brave sailors confronting the unknown. Writers compared him to heroes of antiquity, Odysseus, Jason, or Alexander the Great. He was called the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, a man chosen by God to expand the bounds of Christendom. But beneath that admiration lay something darker, a seed of superiority that would grow into centuries of domination. The idea that the New World was a blank page to be written upon by European hands justified conquest and colonization. Lands already home to ancient civilizations were described as discovered. Peoples with deep traditions and knowledge were called savages. This distortion of perspective became one of history's most enduring myths, the notion that civilization began only when Europe arrived. And yet, the people Columbus met, the Taino, the Arawak, and others, had societies rich in culture and community. They farmed, traded, and lived in harmony with their environment. They had art, music, and spiritual beliefs rooted in nature. Columbus saw their generosity and wrote that they were kind and gentle, but his admiration was quickly replaced by exploitation. When they could not produce enough gold to satisfy his demands, he turned to violence. Those who failed to meet the quota had their hands cut off. Others were enslaved or killed. The paradise he had found became a place of horror. The Spanish crown, upon hearing reports of the brutality, tried at times to restrain it through laws, but the hunger for wealth and power proved stronger than royal decrees. The system known as the encomienda allowed colonists to protect and Christianize native peoples in exchange for their labor, a thin disguise for slavery. As the Caribbean's indigenous population collapsed under disease and forced work, the Spanish turned to Africa. Ships began to cross the Atlantic filled with enslaved men and women, torn from their homes to toil in the mines and plantations of the Americas. Thus, Columbus's voyages indirectly gave rise to the transatlantic slave trade, one of the darkest chapters in human history. The discovery of America had set the world in motion, but it also set in motion an endless cycle of exploitation. Yet, not everything that followed was destruction. Alongside suffering came exchange, innovation, and transformation. The Columbian Exchange, the flow of plants, animals, and ideas between the Old and New Worlds, reshaped the planet's ecology. Corn and potatoes fed Europe's growing population. Coffee and sugar reshaped economies. Horses and cattle changed life for Native Americans on the plains. Even the humble tomato, unknown in Italy before Columbus, became a staple of Mediterranean cuisine. The world became richer, not only in goods but in possibilities. The concept of the world itself expanded. For the first time, humanity could see itself as part of a single interconnected sphere. In art, literature, and science, this realization inspired a revolution. Explorers became the heroes of the Renaissance imagination. The horizon, once feared, became a symbol of destiny. Beyond was no longer a place of monsters. It was a place of promise. But the cost of that promise remained immense. Indigenous cultures were shattered, their gods silenced, their temples destroyed. Languages disappeared, replaced by Spanish, Portuguese, and English. The same faith that Columbus believed was guiding him to glory became a weapon against those he encountered. It is easy to condemn him from the distance of centuries, but it is also necessary to understand him. Columbus lived in a world where the church defined truth, where the cosmos revolved around divine purpose, and where salvation and conquest often walked hand in hand. In his mind, he was not invading, he was fulfilling prophecy. He saw his voyages as part of a divine plan to spread Christianity to the ends of the earth. He even wrote to the Spanish monarchs that his discoveries would provide the wealth needed to retake Jerusalem from Muslim control and bring about the second coming of Christ. His faith and ambition were inseparable. This duality of faith and greed defined not only Columbus, but his entire age. As Europe surged into the Atlantic, its nations began to compete fiercely for domination. Portugal claimed Brazil. England and France established colonies in North America. The Netherlands built trading outposts in the Caribbean. The New World became a battlefield for the old powers. But for the people already living there, it was a story of resilience and survival. Across the Americas, indigenous communities fought, adapted, and endured. They learned new languages, new tools, and new religions, yet preserved fragments of their traditions through song, story, and art. Even under the weight of conquest, their spirit did not vanish. Today, that spirit endures, in the descendants of those first peoples, in the rhythms of Latin music, in the faces of the Americas themselves. The story of Columbus cannot be told without theirs. And so, his discovery was not only of new lands, but of new realities, a clash of worlds that created the modern age. By the 18th century, long after his death, Columbus had become a myth, a symbol of exploration, progress, and the human drive to seek the unknown. Poets praised him as the man who gave a world to Castile and Leon. In the 19th century, as nations like the United States sought their own origin stories, he was recast as a visionary hero, a man of destiny. The name Columbia, used for cities, rivers, and even the country of Colombia, came to embody the spirit of the New World. Yet, as centuries passed and voices of the oppressed began to rise, his image began to fracture. The very deeds once hailed as heroic came to be seen as destructive. In the 20th and 21st centuries, indigenous activists and historians began to reclaim their narratives, arguing that Columbus's arrival marked not a discovery, but an invasion. Monuments that once stood in triumph were re-examined, sometimes torn down. The day once known as Columbus Day was renamed in many places as Indigenous Peoples' Day, a shift from celebration to reflection. This change does not erase history, it expands it. It reminds us that every story has more than one side. Columbus's voyage was both a beginning and an ending, a dawn and a dusk. If we strip away the myths and look at the man himself, what remains is the raw essence of humanity: curiosity, courage, error, and consequence. His journey reminds us that exploration is never purely noble or purely evil. It is always both. It brings light, but it also casts shadows. And those shadows stretch far, across time, across oceans, into our present. The modern world, with all its diversity and its divisions, was born in that moment when 3 small ships left Spain and crossed into the unknown. Every airplane that circles the globe, every ship that crosses the sea, every satellite that maps the Earth, all trace their lineage back to that daring act of navigation. Columbus sought Asia and found America, but what he truly discovered was humanity's boundless capacity to imagine something beyond itself, for better or worse. In the end, Christopher Columbus became more than a man. He became a mirror. In him, every generation has seen its own reflection: ambition, faith, courage, cruelty, and the eternal desire to reach beyond the known. His life was not one of quiet contemplation or moral clarity. It was a storm, of belief colliding with consequence, of discovery intertwined with destruction. And through that storm, the world itself was reborn. The story of Columbus is the story of how humanity learned to see itself as global. Before 1492, continents were isolated, cultures evolved separately, and the world map was filled with blanks. After Columbus, there were no more edges. The world became a single stage, vast, connected, and inescapably shared. That change cannot be undone. It is written into every port, every city, every family name born of the mixing of peoples who met because of that voyage. Yet, to understand Columbus is not to excuse him. It is to recognize that history is made not by saints, but by imperfect men, men whose dreams and delusions reshape the earth. In the decades after his death, explorers carried forward his legacy of discovery and its contradictions. Ferdinand Magellan, sailing for Spain in 1519, proved that the globe could indeed be circumnavigated, confirming what Columbus had only guessed. Vasco Núñez de Balboa reached the Pacific Ocean, glimpsing the vast sea that truly separated the Old World from the New. Amerigo Vespucci's letters convinced scholars that these lands were not Asia, but something entirely different, a fourth part of the world. From these voyages came a new vision of Earth, round, finite, and full of possibilities, but they also brought a new kind of empire, one built not just on conquest, but on the movement of people, goods, and ideas across oceans. The Atlantic became a highway of human history, carrying not only explorers and traders, but also enslaved Africans, indigenous captives, missionaries, scientists, and dreamers. Each crossing carried both promise and pain. The New World became the world's new center of gravity, a place where cultures collided and fused, giving birth to the global civilization we know today. Every continent was changed. Europe grew rich and powerful, fueled by colonial wealth. Africa was ravaged by the slave trade. The Americas were reshaped by foreign rule and migration. Asia, though distant, entered new networks of exchange. And through it all, the idea that began in Columbus's mind, that the world was one, reachable, and knowable, took root. Even now, that idea shapes us. Every satellite orbiting the planet, every voyage to Mars, every search for new frontiers in science or space echoes the same impulse, the yearning to go beyond the horizon. But there is a lesson buried deep in his legacy, a warning as well as a wonder. Discovery is never neutral. It always comes with a cost. The new is built upon what is lost. The world Columbus opened brought wealth and progress, but it also brought genocide, enslavement, and cultural erasure. For every ship that carried gold home to Spain, another carried suffering across the sea. It is said that when Columbus returned from his first voyage, he wrote that the people he had met were of great love and without greed, yet he could not see them as equals. To him, they were souls to be claimed, workers to be used, subjects to be ruled. That blindness, the inability to recognize humanity in the other, became the foundation of colonization. 500 years later, the world still wrestles with that same blindness, the struggle to see the humanity in those who are different. Columbus's story endures not because it is ancient, but because it is timeless. He represents the dual edge of human progress, the courage to explore and the capacity to destroy. His journey reminds us that every advance carries responsibility, that curiosity must walk hand in hand with compassion. For the people of the Americas, his arrival was apocalypse and Genesis at once. Old worlds died, new ones began. Languages mixed, faiths blended, bloodlines merged. Out of pain and wonder came the identity of the modern Americas, a fusion of native, European, African, and later Asian influences. The continents became a living testament to both tragedy and transformation. It is no coincidence that the same hemisphere born from conquest would one day champion freedom. The revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries in the United States, in Latin America, arose from the same soil Columbus first touched. The concept of liberty, transplanted across the ocean, took root in the very lands once claimed for kings. History, in its strange symmetry, turned oppression into rebellion and discovery into independence. Today, the legacy of Columbus continues to evolve. His statues stand in some cities and fall in others. His name adorns schools, rivers, and even space missions. And yet, for many, it also represents loss and suffering. The debate of his legacy is not a battle over the past, but over how we tell the story of the present. To remember Columbus honestly is to remember everything: the courage of the voyage, the beauty of the encounter, the cruelty of the conquest, and the complexity of what followed. It is to see that no story worth telling is simple. History is not made of heroes and villains alone. It is made of human beings, driven by hope, fear, and vision. Columbus was all of these things. Imagine for a moment the night before he set sail. Standing on the deck of the Santa Maria, the salty wind in his face, the stars glittering above an ocean that no one had crossed. He must have felt the weight of both dread and destiny. Behind him lay a continent of kings and cathedrals. Before him, nothing but the unknown. In that silence, he carried the hopes of a world desperate to expand, and the seeds of consequences he could never have foreseen. When dawn came and the ships slipped away from the Spanish shore, a new chapter of human history began, one that would rewrite the fate of every nation and every people. In the centuries since, humanity has continued to sail, not always across oceans, but across ideas, inventions, and frontiers. We send probes to distant planets, build machines that think, and reach for stars once thought unreachable. Each time we do, we repeat Columbus's act, stepping into the unknown with faith that there is something beyond. But if we are to learn from him, we must do more than admire his courage. We must remember his errors. We must recognize that exploration without empathy leads not to enlightenment, but to exploitation. That the real discovery humanity must make is not of new lands, but of wisdom, humility, and compassion. Perhaps that is the ultimate legacy of Columbus, a reminder that the world is vast, but fragile, full of wonder, but also full of wounds. The ocean he crossed still whispers his name, not as a triumph, but as a question. What does it mean to discover? What does it mean to conquer? And can we ever truly separate the two? In the end, the story of Columbus is the story of us all, flawed, curious, restless, beings forever reaching for something greater. His voyage may have begun in 1492, but its echoes reach into our present and beyond, into every frontier we dare to cross. As the waves rolled behind his ships and the horizon widened before him, Columbus could not have known that he was changing not just geography, but the destiny of the entire human race. he could not have known that the world he helped create would be one of both glory and grief, a world still trying to reconcile its past with its promise. 500 years later, the sails of the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria still drift through our imagination, symbols of courage and caution, of faith and folly. They remind us that every step into the unknown carries a shadow, and that understanding history is not about worshiping heroes, but about learning from humanity itself. So, as we look back at that fateful voyage, at the man who dared to sail where others feared, we see not just the discovery of America, but the discovery of what it means to be human, to dream, to err, to hope, and to change the world in ways we never expect. And that, perhaps, is the truest meaning of discovery. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.